The Galactic Concord was a society built on the serene, unshakable bedrock of certainty. For millennia, every significant species that had joined its gilded ranks had shared one defining trait: precognition. The ability to see the branching, shimmering pathways of the future was not a party trick. It was the fundamental organizing principle of their civilization. Laws were not reactions to crimes committed, but gentle course corrections to prevent crimes from ever being conceived. Political debates were not clashes of ideology, but calm, collaborative efforts to prune the timestreams, selecting the optimal future for all. Deceit was a logical impossibility, a childish concept like hiding behind one's hands, as your intentions and their most probable outcomes were an open book to everyone around you. The result was a society of profound peace and stability, a perfectly tuned engine humming along a predictable track. It was also a society that had completely forgotten how to be surprised. Ambassador Vale of the crystalline mind of Cygnus was a master of this temporal dance. His consciousness, housed within a flawless, multifaceted crystal body, perceived reality as an infinite, overlapping tapestry of cause and effect. As he floated through the grand promenade of Concord Station, the light of a dozen alien suns refracting through his form, he was simultaneously navigating 1,000 conversations. He saw the future where he accepted a trade proposal from the gelatinous Voltan hegemony, leading to a minor economic boom and a tedious series of celebratory banquets. He saw the future where he refused, resulting in a slight diplomatic chill but freeing up his schedule for a desired period of silent communion. He weighed, measured, and selected the optimal path with the ease of a creature breathing. He was to meet with a delegation from the Kelth, a species of insectoids, to finalize a territorial survey. He saw the meeting going smoothly, the signing of the treaty, the polite exchange of crystalline chimes and chitinous clicks. His future for the next several cycles was a placid, predictable stream. That was why no one could explain what happened next. The meeting with the Kelth never occurred. When Ambassador Vial failed to arrive at the designated time, an unprecedented breach of protocol in itself, his aides grew concerned. They could see his immediate past, a calm meditation in his secure private spire. They could see their own futures, where they would eventually gain access to his chamber. But the intervening moments, the space where Vial should have floated from his spire to the transport hub, were blank. It was not a clouded future or a confusing one. It was a perfect, seamless void. A hole in the fabric of time. Panic, an emotion so archaic it was almost an academic concept, began to ripple through the station's security detail. They converged on the ambassador's spire, a gleaming needle of pure crystal suspended in the station's zero-gravity diplomatic quarter. The door was sealed from the inside, its quantum lock fully engaged. Bypassing it, they floated into the chamber. The scene that greeted them was not just impossible. It was a paradox that threatened to unravel their entire understanding of the universe. Ambassador Vial was dead. His crystalline body, normally a vessel of pure, organized light, was shattered. Countless fractures marred its perfect surface, extinguishing the lifelight within. He had been struck by some incredible, focused kinetic force. The cause of death was brutally, shockingly obvious. But the how, the who, the why, these were questions their minds were not equipped to ask. Every precog on the station, from the lowest-ranking guard to the highest council member, focused their sight on the event. They could all see the moments leading up to it, Ambassador Vial meditating peacefully. They could all see the moments after, the silent, fractured crystal floating in the chamber. But the instant of the act itself was a complete and utter null space. A segment of reality had been surgically removed from the time stream, leaving behind no echo, no ghost, no possibility. It was a crime that, according to every law of physics and causality they knew, could not have happened. Yet there was the body. The Concord, for the first time in its long, placid history, had an impossible murder on its hands. And they had absolutely no idea what to do. The emergency session of the Concord Council was a study in controlled panic. The 12 highest-ranking members representing a dozen different species convened in the high chamber, their thoughts a discordant chorus of disbelief and fear. The news of Ambassador Vial's murder had spread through the telepathic and precognitive networks like a virus, shattering the placid certainty that held their society together. Their entire system of justice was preventative, based on pruning undesirable futures. The concept of investigating a completed event, A fixed point in the immutable past was utterly alien to them. They were architects of the future, and a murderer had just proven that the past was a house of cards they had never bothered to inspect. It is a temporal weapon of unknown origin, stated a being of pure energy, its form shimmering anxiously, a direct assault on causality itself. No weapon could create a perfect void, countered a silicon-based life form, its voice a series of harmonic chimes. The energy required would be catastrophic. This is a paradox, a wound in reality. It is a matter for physicists, not security. The debate raged, a frantic search for a precognitive solution to a problem that had somehow sidestepped precognition entirely. They were the most powerful beings in the galaxy, capable of steering the fate of civilizations. Yet they were as helpless as children in the dark. It was then that Counselor Jean, an ancient plant-like being whose species had joined the Concord eons ago, rustled its leafy appendages. "We are blind," it whispered, its voice like the sigh of wind through ancient trees. "We are looking at the future for an answer that lies in the past. We are trying to see a shadow by staring at the sun. We are not equipped for this, but there is a species that might be." A ripple of confusion went through the council. Every species of note was a member, and every member was a precog. "Of whom do you speak, Counselor?" The energy being asked. "The humans," Jean replied. The name hung in the air, thick with condescension. The humans, a minor, non-voting Tier 7 species that had been granted an embassy on the Concord station, out of a sense of patronizing curiosity. They were a biological anomaly, a sapient species that was completely, utterly blind to the timestream. They could not see a second into the future. They lived in a chaotic, perpetual state of surprise, reacting to events as they happened. To the Concord, they were pitiable, a race of charmingly primitive animals whose lack of sight was considered a profound cosmic disability. "The blind ones?" chimed the silicon being, incredulous. "What could they possibly offer? They can barely navigate their own chaotic lives. Their entire history is a litany of preventable disasters." "Precisely," Jean rustled. "They have spent their entire existence picking up the pieces after things have gone wrong. They have developed methodologies, disciplines based on the assumption of ignorance. They do not look for what will happen. They search for what has happened. They may be blind, but they have learned to see in the dark." The idea was radical, desperate, and deeply embarrassing, but they had no other options. The message sent to the human embassy was curt and laden with the arrogance of those forced to ask for help from their inferiors. The message found its way to a small, cluttered office in the least fashionable sector of the embassy station. Detective Elias Vance, formerly of the Earth Police Directorate, Homicide Division, now a security consultant in a forced, boring retirement, read the message on his antique data slate. He was a man built of grizzled edges and quiet observation, his face a roadmap of a life spent looking at the worst humanity had to offer. "Hey, Doc," he grunted, not looking up. "You're not going to believe this." Dr. Aris Thorne looked up from the fossilized trilobite he was meticulously cleaning. He was a forensic anthropologist by trade, a scientist who coaxed stories from silent bones and forgotten dust. He was on the station as a cultural attaché, a post he found equally as boring as Vance found his. "Let me guess," Aris said, his voice sharp and precise. "The station's nutrient paste allotment has been reduced by 5%, and they need a human to file a formal complaint." "Worse," Vance said, a small wry smile touching his lips for the first time in months. "One of the shiny ones got himself murdered." Aris froze, his brush hovering over the fossil. Murder, on Concord Station. It was a statistical and theoretical impossibility. "They want us," Vance continued, standing up and stretching, his old bones popping. "Seems they can't figure out how to solve a crime that's already happened. They need someone to teach them how to look backwards." He picked up his coat, a worn synth-leather trench coat that was an antique even by his standards. Aris carefully set down his tools. The greatest minds in the galaxy, the seers of futures and weavers of fate, were stumped, and they were calling in the two humans who were professional experts in the one thing the Concord had never experienced: the past. It was, Aris had to admit, the most interesting thing that had happened all year. The arrival of the two humans at the crime scene was met with an atmosphere of thinly veiled contempt and desperate hope. The spire of the late Ambassador Vielle was cordoned off by Concord enforcers, their crystalline bodies shimmering with agitated light. They parted for Vance and Aris, their telepathic whispers a wave of pity and skepticism. The blind ones have arrived. What can they possibly do but stumble in the dark? Vance ignored them, his gaze sweeping over the chamber. It was just a room. A big fancy zero-G room, but a room nonetheless. And in the center of it was a body. It was the same no matter what planet you were on. "All right, Twinkles, give us some space." Vance grunted at the enforcers who hovered uselessly around the shattered ambassador. "And turn up the lights. It's like a cave in here." The enforcers recoiled, offended by the gruff command and the implication that their standard ambient light was insufficient. Aris stepped forward, offering a more diplomatic touch. "My colleague requires a higher contrast visual spectrum to analyze the particulate matter in the room," he explained smoothly. The enforcers reluctantly complied, and the room was flooded with harsh white light. For the first time, Vance and Aris could see the scene clearly, their non-psychic eyes unburdened by the temporal void that had blinded everyone else. "Okay, Doc, let's get to work," Vance said, kneeling to open a large, well-worn case. It was a standard-issue homicide investigation kit from the EPD, filled with brushes, evidence bags, chemical vials, and scanning equipment. One of the enforcers floated closer, its form pulsing with curiosity. "What is that collection of primitive tools?" It projected. Vance held up a small brush with fine, synthetic fibers. "This," he said, "is for finding things that are too small to see. We call it a clue." He began to gently brush the area around the shattered crystal, a fine cloud of dust becoming visible in the bright light. The enforcers watched, baffled. Aris, meanwhile, had deployed a series of small floating sensors around the victim's body, his own kit a more modern and scientific affair. The sensors began a multispectral scan, analyzing the body not for psychic residue but for its physical properties. "You are touching the dust?" another enforcer asked, its tone scandalized. "Why, the past is gone. It cannot be interrogated." "Son, the past is never gone," Vance said without looking up. "It just breaks down into smaller pieces. You just have to know how to read them." He pointed his luminol sprayer at the far wall and sprayed. A faint, ghostly blue pattern flared into existence. "Blood," Vance stated flatly. The enforcers pulsed with confusion. The victim didn't have blood. "Not his," Vance clarified. "Someone else's. Or something else's. Looks like our killer wasn't as clean as he thought." While the precogs had been staring into a blank future, they had completely missed the microscopic evidence screaming at them from the past. Aris's sensors beeped. "Elias, I'm getting something," he said, his eyes glued to his data slate. "The fracture patterns on the ambassador are specific. They didn't originate from a single point of impact. They emanate from the inside out, yet there's no sign of an explosive device." Vance floated over to look at the holographic model Aris had generated. "So he was hit with something that shattered him from the inside? Like a focused sonic pulse?" "Possibly," Aris mused. "But there's also this. A faint energy residue on the crystal fragments. It's not a signature I recognize, but it has the decay properties of a very old, very unstable power source." Vance's eyes narrowed. He moved toward the quantum lock door, ignoring the body for a moment. He ran a gloved finger along the seam, then examined it under a microscanner. "There it is," he whispered. A microscopic scratch. A single tiny point of physical contact on a door that was supposed to be intangible when locked. "He didn't phase through the door," Vance said, a theory beginning to coalesce in his mind. He picked the lock. The enforcers looked at each other, the concept so ludicrously low-tech it was almost incomprehensible. The temporal void that masks the event. "It wasn't a weapon used to kill the ambassador," Aris said, the pieces clicking into place. "It was a side effect. The killer is using some kind of technology that operates outside of conventional space-time, which is why it leaves no psychic or precognitive signature." Vance nodded. This wasn't a psychic attack. This was a physical break-and-enter. The killer used old-fashioned tools and old-fashioned violence. "And the reason you all couldn't see it," he said, looking directly at the lead enforcer, "is because you weren't looking. You were too busy trying to see the future to bother examining the present." The enforcer had no response. For the first time, the shimmering, confident beings of the Concord were beginning to understand the difference between seeing everything and noticing anything. The investigation, to the consternation of the Concord Council, began to move backward. Vance and Aris demanded access to Ambassador Viel's records, Not his future probabilities, but his past appointments, his communication logs, his political affiliations. The council aides complied with baffled reluctance, providing data they considered utterly irrelevant. "Why do you wish to know who he met with yesterday?" one aide asked. "We can see his future meetings for the next cycle. They were all peaceful." "That's because he's dead," Vance said bluntly. "The future doesn't matter anymore. We need to know who had a reason to want him dead. We need a motive." The word motive had to be translated and explained, the concept of a past grievance fueling a present action being a strangely abstract idea to the precogs. To them, grievances were identified and smoothed over long before they could fester. The idea that a grudge could be held, nurtured, and acted upon was a symptom of the chaotic, blind way that humans lived. Vance and Aris began conducting interviews, another process the Concord found bizarre and intrusive. They started with Ambassador Cathar, a rival of Viel's from a species of sentient gas clouds. "This is an absurdity," Cathar swirled, its form agitated. "My intentions are open to the council. They can see I held no violent futures regarding Ambassador Viel. This interrogation is a primitive and offensive human custom." "I'm not interested in your future, pal," Vance countered, leaning forward in his chair, his voice low and firm. "I'm interested in the trade deal you lost to Viel last month, the one concerning the mineral rights to Xylo 7. My records show it cost your hegemony a fortune. That sounds like a pretty good motive to me." Cathar swirled angrily but offered no substantive reply. The human wasn't accusing him of a future crime he could easily disprove. He was accusing him of a past emotion, an invisible wound to his pride and profits. For the first time in his life, the ambassador felt defensive, a feeling he did not enjoy. The human's blindness was, paradoxically, allowing him to see things that should have remained hidden. While Vance ruffled the carefully arranged feathers of the diplomatic corps, Aris took the data chip they had found at the scene and the energy residue readings back to the embassy lab. The chip was heavily encrypted, but it wasn't the lock that interested him. It was the lockpick. The encryption had been bypassed using a brute force decryption algorithm, so ancient and inefficient it was almost charming. It was the digital equivalent of using a battering ram on a quantum lock. "Whoever our killer is, he's a historian," Aris said to Vance over their private comm. "Or a Luddite." The energy residue was even more telling. After cross-referencing it with deep archive data, histories from before the Concord was even formed, Aris found a match. "It's from a null entropy device," he explained. "A theoretical piece of technology from the Dark Ages. It was designed to create a small, localized bubble of absolute stasis, effectively isolating it from the rest of space-time. The project was abandoned because the bubbles were unstable and collapsed within minutes. But for those few minutes it would be invisible to any form of energy-based detection, including precognition. The pieces snapped into place with a terrifying click. The scratch on the door, the inefficient decryption, the ancient energy signature. Their killer wasn't a precog with a new terrifying power. Their killer was a non-precog, or something that could mimic one, using forgotten primitive technology to exploit the Concord's greatest strength. The precog's universal sight was like a global security system that could detect any advanced weapon. But their killer had just walked through the front door with a rock. "He's one of us," Vance whispered, the realization dawning on him. "Not a human, maybe. But he's blind. He thinks like us." Their investigation had just gone from a simple murder to a galaxy-spanning conspiracy. Who else was blind in a galaxy of Seers? And who would have access to this forgotten technology and the motive to use it to destabilize the entire Galactic Concord? As they pondered this, a silent alarm tripped on Aris's console. An unauthorized access attempt was being made on the embassy's secure server, specifically targeting the new case file they had just created for the murder of Ambassador Viel. The probe was sophisticated, but it had one flaw. It was trying to predict their future security protocols, not bypass their current ones. It was a precog, and it was getting nervous. Vance and Aris looked at each other. They had their first real lead, and they had just officially graduated from being the investigators to being the targets. The attempted hack on their case file was a gift. To the precog who sent it, it was likely a subtle exploratory probe, an attempt to glimpse the future of their investigation. To Elias Vance, it was a clumsy confession scrawled on a wall. It was the digital equivalent of a killer returning to the scene of the crime. While Aris's fingers danced across his console, tracing the ghost's path through the embassy's firewalls. Vance paced the lab, the familiar thrill of the hunt rekindling in his old bones. The precog saw the universe as a river, its currents flowing inexorably toward a predictable sea. Vance saw it as a web, every strand connected, and something had just caused a single, crucial thread to vibrate. It's amateurish, Aris mused, shaking his head. The probe uses a predictive algorithm. It's trying to guess our future countersignatures instead of defeating our present ones. It's like trying to win a chess game by only looking at the opponent's final move, without bothering to study the board. He isolated the probe's origin point, but as expected, it was masked by layers of proxies, bouncing through a dozen different systems on the station. However, the energy signature of the relays it used was unique. They were proprietary high-security nodes. The hack wasn't routed through the public network, Aris said, his eyes narrowing. It came from within the Concord's own high-level diplomatic channels. So our killer is a big shot, Vance grunted. Or works for one. He cross-referenced the node's access logs with the list of political enemies he was compiling. There were dozens of potential matches, but one name appeared with damning frequency: the Temporal Purity Foundation. It was a powerful, quasi-religious political faction whose core belief was that universal precognition was the galaxy's ultimate destiny. They advocated for the segregation and eventual guidance of non-precog species, whom they considered a chaotic and destabilizing influence, a cosmic disease. Ambassador Vael, with his progressive push for the rights of blind species, had been their most powerful and vocal opponent. "They're watching us," Vance said, stating the obvious. "They see us digging. They see us getting closer to their little club, and they're getting nervous." He stopped pacing, and a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. "Good. Let's give them something to watch." Aris looked up, recognizing the look in his partner's eye. It was the look that preceded a wild, improbable, and usually effective plan. "We can't outsee them, Doc, so we have to outthink them. We're going to set a trap, not a physical one. A logical one. We're going to write a story, lay out the breadcrumbs, and let their future sight lead them right into a lie." Their plan was interrupted by an official summons. They were called before the Concord Council, or rather a subcommittee hastily assembled to manage the political fallout of their investigation. The mood was icy. "Your methods are disruptive," Counselor Jean, their only real advocate, rustled apologetically. Ambassador Cathar, the gas cloud being, swirled with indignation. "The human has baselessly accused me of harboring a motive. This is an assault on my character. My future actions prove my innocence." Vance resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "We have received formal complaints from 17 different diplomatic offices," another counselor stated. "You are ordered to cease this line of inquiry. Your focus is to be on the impossible technology, not on the internal politics of the Concord. You are upsetting the peace." Vance looked at the council, at these beings who could see all of time but were blind to the truth in front of them. They were more afraid of a political scandal than they were of the murderer in their midst. The system wasn't just unequipped to find the killer. It was actively working to protect him. They were well and truly on their own. The lower levels of Concord Station were a different world, a chaotic and vibrant maze of commerce and industry that the high-level diplomats above preferred to ignore. It was here, amidst the steam vents of alien cantinas and the cluttered stalls of off-world traders, that Vance and Aris chose to stage their play. The central prop was a small encrypted data chip, painstakingly crafted by Aris. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, containing layers of fabricated evidence, shipping manifests, financial records, coded communications, that all pointed to a fictitious, high-level arms dealer. They gave him a name: Xylox, a supposed member of a rare non-precog species from the Galactic Rim. "A perfect phantom. The stage is set," Vance said over their private comm channel. He was seated in a dingy cantina, nursing a drink that smelled vaguely of burnt wiring. From his vantage point, he had a clear view of a public data port known for its lax security. Aris, positioned a level above, had a sensor array focused on the same spot. "The precogs will be watching us," Aris replied, his voice calm. "When they see us approach the data port, they'll focus on the probable futures. Our job is to make the fake future the most compelling one." Vance finished his drink, stood up, and began to walk. As he moved, he knew the eyes of his invisible enemy were upon him, their minds sifting through the timelines. He walked to the data port, looked around with theatrical caution, and slipped the data chip into a hidden recess. He then turned and walked away, melting back into the crowd. The bait was laid. From a silent, darkened chamber high in the diplomatic spire, a being watched. Let us call him the Architect. He was not a single being, but the Gestalt consciousness of the Temporal Purity Foundation's inner circle. Through the eyes of a dozen paid informants and 100 different precognitive threads, the Architect had been observing the humans. He had seen their primitive, ghoulish forensics. He had felt the sting of their illogical, linear questioning. They were an irritation, a messy variable in a perfect equation. He had seen Vance approach the data port and plant the chip. Immediately, his precognitive senses flared. He saw a dozen futures branch out from that single action. He saw the humans retrieving the chip later. He saw them decrypting its contents. He saw the name Xylox. He saw a future where Concord enforcers, acting on the humans' information, raided a cargo bay and engaged in a firefight with a heavily armed syndicate. Yet something felt wrong. The narrative was too clean. The clues were too convenient. It was a story, a sequence of A to B to C causality that was the hallmark of primitive linear thought. The Architect was used to the elegant, branching probabilities of the timestream, not the crude straight line of a human detective novel. But the futures were clear. The firefight, the capture of Xylox's subordinates, the trail leading to a major arms trafficking ring. It was all there, a visible, tangible future. His own precognitive sight was confirming the human's discovery. Reluctantly, he decided he could not ignore it. The risk of a non-precog arms dealer operating under their noses, perhaps the very one who supplied the murderer, was too great. Through a series of subtle psychic nudges to a high-ranking enforcer captain, he arranged for a tactical team to be dispatched to the cargo bay his sight had shown him. Vance and Aris watched from a distance as a heavily armed enforcer squad swarmed Cargo Bay 7. They breached the bay with overwhelming force, only to find it completely empty, save for a few maintenance drones. The enforcers stood in confused silence, their own precognitive senses telling them a firefight was supposed to happen here. It was a future that had simply vanished. High above, the Architect felt a cold, alien sensation for the first time, the sting of being outmaneuvered. The humans hadn't been following a lead. They had been creating one. They had used his own greatest strength, his vision of the future, against him, turning it into a lens to view a work of fiction. He had not been observing an investigation. He had been tricked into reading a script. For the first time, the Architect realized these blind, primitive creatures were not just a nuisance. They were dangerous. With their enemy chasing ghosts in the lower levels, Vance and Aris used the precious time to pursue their real lead. The Temporal Purity Foundation was more than just a political faction. It was a deeply entrenched and lavishly funded organization with connections in every branch of the Concord government. As Aris sliced through their public financial records, all perfectly legal and transparent, of course, Vance used old-fashioned legwork, talking to disgruntled embassy aides and low-level functionaries, the kind of invisible people the precogs never bothered to watch. They began to paint a picture of the Foundation's true agenda. It was not just about purity, it was about control. They were systematically acquiring assets, blocking legislation, and placing their members in key positions, all with the goal of halting the Concord's slow, reluctant march toward greater inclusivity. Ambassador Vielle had been their single greatest obstacle. His Interspecies Inclusivity Act would have granted minor, non-precog species like humans a path to representation on the Council, a move the Foundation considered an existential threat. They saw Vielle as a disease, Aris said, looking up from his console, a chaotic variable that threatened their perfect, predictable garden. The motive was no longer just political. It was ideological, bordering on zealotry. They had found the why. Now they needed the who and the how. The key, they realized, lay with the victim himself. The Concord, in their focus on the killer, had largely ignored the man who was killed. Vance and Aris requisitioned Vielle's personal effects and research archives. What they found was astonishing. Vielle was not just a diplomat. In secret, he was a xenoarchaeologist and a historian, with a passionate, almost obsessive interest in the pre-Concord era. His private logs were filled with research into the very blind species he was championing. He had been studying their histories, their philosophies, their unique linear approach to problem solving. And in a heavily encrypted personal file, they found his final heretical project. File had been secretly acquiring and studying the exact same null entropy technology that had been used in his murder. He wasn't just a random target. Vance breathed, staring at the schematics on the screen. They killed him with his own research. Vile's notes became more and more frantic in the cycles leading up to his death. He hadn't just been studying the technology. He had been trying to understand its implications. His final entry was a chilling, paradigm-shifting hypothesis. He theorized that universal precognition was not the apex of sapient evolution, but a potential trap, an evolutionary dead end. He wrote, "A society that can see every possible future loses the incentive to create a new one. It becomes stagnant, predictable, endlessly optimizing the same variables. Such a society, for all its power, would become terrifyingly vulnerable to a truly novel idea, a thought that comes not from the future, but from a deep and creative understanding of the past. It would be vulnerable to a predator that hunts with logic." There it was, the entire conspiracy laid bare. Vile had discovered the Concord's fatal weakness. He had realized that their greatest strength was also a crippling vulnerability. The Temporal Purity Foundation hadn't killed him just to stop a piece of legislation. They had killed him to silence a heretical truth that threatened to bring down their entire worldview. He had been about to prove that the blind were not disabled. They were simply playing a different and perhaps superior game. The architect was furious. The deception of the humans was a profound insult, a violation of the natural order. These linear creatures, these primitives, had successfully manipulated a being who could perceive time itself. It was as if a microbe had outwitted a star. The chase in the lower levels had not only been fruitless, it had exposed his pawns and made him a fool. The time for subtle observation and manipulation was over. The humans were digging too deep, their primitive tools of logic and reason uncovering truths that should have remained buried. The architect decided to remind the Concord and its new, unwelcome consultants where the real power lay. The target was Counselor Jean. During a full session of the Concord Council, as the plant-like being was delivering a speech, it suddenly stopped. Its leafy appendages drooped, its bioluminescent glow faded to a dull, sickly gray. A single psychic scream, silent to all but the precogs in the room, echoed through the chamber. John's mind, a consciousness that had serenely navigated the time streams for centuries, had been shattered. It was not dead, but its consciousness had been forcibly splintered, flooded with a billion simultaneous contradictory futures. It was left a catatonic, living statue, its mind lost in a labyrinth of infinite possibility. There was no murder weapon. There was no temporal void. It was a pure psychic assault, as elegant as it was devastating. It was untraceable, a crime committed with the very power that was supposed to make crime impossible. The architect was sending a message. I am still a god in my own house. The Concord was thrown into a new level of panic. The killer was still among them, and he could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time without leaving a single clue that their minds could grasp. That evening, a message arrived on Vance's private terminal. It had bypassed every embassy security layer, every firewall appearing on his screen as if by magic. The text was simple, written in the human's own language. You are blind things digging where you don't belong. The Concord is a garden, meticulously cultivated. I am the gardener who prunes the weeds. Your investigation is over. Leave, or the next mind I shatter will not be a friend of yours but an enemy of mine, and his madness will be blamed on your chaotic interference. You will be held responsible for the chaos you have sown. Vance read the message twice. Aris looked over his shoulder, his face grim. The threat was clear. It was also a masterstroke of political maneuvering. The architect wasn't threatening them directly, a threat he might not be able to follow through on against their psychically null minds. Instead, he was threatening to create a political disaster that would be pinned squarely on them. They were being framed for future crimes. He's boxing us in, Aris said quietly. He's turning the whole system against us. Vance leaned back in his chair, the screen's faint light reflecting in his weary eyes. They had the motive. They had the means. They had the conspiracy. But their enemy had just changed the rules of the game entirely. He was no longer just a murderer. He was a terrorist, holding the fragile peace of the Concord hostage. And he had just handed the two blind detectives a ticking clock. The architect's threat hung in the air of their small lab like a toxic gas. It was a masterful move, a gambit only a precog could conceive, holding the future political stability of the Concord hostage. Any further investigation on their part could trigger another psychic attack, and the architect had already laid the groundwork to have the resulting chaos blamed on the disruptive humans. They were being framed for a crime that hadn't even happened yet. Aris, ever the pragmatist, began running scenarios. We could present our findings on the Foundation to the Council now, he reasoned. But it's circumstantial. Ideology is not proof of murder. They'll see it as a desperate accusation from the very beings implicated in the newest attack. They'll bury us, Vance agreed, his face grim. He stared at the message on the screen at the words, "I am the gardener who prunes the weeds." A gardener. Someone who maintains order, who clips away anything that doesn't fit. The architect saw himself not as a killer but as a preserver of a perfect static reality, and that was his weakness. He's obsessed with the future, Vance said, a new thought cutting through his frustration. Everything he does, every move he makes is to secure a specific, predictable timeline. He uses his sight to prune the future, so we're going to use a weapon he has no defense against. Aris looked at him, puzzled. What weapon? We have nothing. We have the past, Doc, Vance said, a glint in his eye. The one thing a precog can't change, can't prune, and can't run from. We're going to stop investigating this murder. Aris stared at him, dumbfounded. We're going to start investigating a much older one. The plan was a pure human gambit, born from a history of dealing with criminals who thought they had gotten away with it. The Concord had no concept of a cold case. To them, a crime not prevented was a paradox, and a past event was a fixed, uninteresting point. They would never think to look backward with suspicion. Aris, I need you to go deeper into the archives, Vance commanded, his energy renewed. Forget Vale for a minute. I want you to find every diplomat, every aide, every activist who has ever publicly opposed the Temporal Purity Foundation and subsequently chosen a future path that led them away from the Concord. Find me a disappearance. Find me a quiet retirement. Find me a skeleton. While Aris began his digital archaeology, Vance went on the offensive. He used his credentials to access the station's minor independent news networks, the gossipy infotainment channels that the high-minded diplomats ignored. He didn't give them a solution. He gave them a story. He leaked selected non-critical details of their investigation, the discovery of the null entropy device, the existence of a powerful political entity that opposed Ambassador Vial's progressive agenda, the fact that the Concord Council was trying to silence the investigation. He didn't name the Foundation, but he drew a tantalizing outline that any decent reporter could fill in. The effect was immediate and to the Concord terrifying. Public opinion, a chaotic and unpredictable force they had never had to manage, erupted. Rumors, speculation, and conspiracy theories flooded the station's data streams. The placid, predictable river of Concord society was suddenly filled with the turbulent, muddy waters of a human-style media frenzy. The architect, for all his ability to see the future, was utterly blindsided by the chaos of the present. For 2 full cycles, Aris Thorne was a ghost haunting the deepest, dustiest corners of the Concord's historical archives. He sifted through trillions of petabytes of data, searching for a pattern. It was a monumental task, like searching for a single misplaced word in a library containing every book ever written. He finally found it not in a security file or a diplomatic communique, but in a dry 50-year-old financial ledger. The entry detailed a massive anonymous donation to the fledgling Temporal Purity Foundation. The donation was made one day after the sudden and unexpected retirement of a Kelth ambassador named Katarik, a brilliant and charismatic diplomat who had been the most vocal and effective opponent of the Foundation's founder. The official record was serene and simple. The Council of the time had consulted the timestreams and had seen that Katarik would choose a future of peaceful, isolated contemplation on his homeworld. His departure was his own choice, a predictable and honorable conclusion to a storied career. There was no foul play because the future showed no foul play, but Aris, applying human suspicion to the placid record, saw the lie. He cross-referenced the ambassador's personal effects manifest. Katarik had left behind a cherished collection of star charts, a family heirloom he had never been without. He found the Kelth's final communication, a message to his broodmate which was cut off mid-sentence. He found that the anonymous donation to the Foundation was transferred from an account whose encryption routing was a primitive precursor to the one used on the data chip found at Vile's murder scene. He didn't retire, Elias Aris said, his voice low with the thrill of discovery. He was erased. They were looking at the architect's original sin. 50 years ago, the Foundation had eliminated its chief rival using the same method, a null entropy device to create a temporal void, followed by a quiet murder. The Precog Council of the time, unable to see the crime, had simply chosen the most placid future available and declared it to be the truth. They had been unwitting accomplices. The Foundation wasn't just a political faction. It was a criminal enterprise born from an unsolved, uninvestigated murder. High in his spire, the architect felt a new and terrifying emotion, the cold dread of the past rising from its grave. His precognitive sight, usually a calm ocean of possibilities, was now a raging storm. The media frenzy ignited by Vance was causing unpredictable futures to sprout like weeds, choking his clarity, and now his senses screamed a new warning. The humans were no longer looking at Vile. They were looking at Katarik. They were looking at him. This was a threat he had never conceived of. How could he defend against history? He could see the humans' probable future actions. They would access the archives, they would find the financial records. But it was like watching a recording of a disaster that had already happened. He couldn't change it. He couldn't prune the past. In a panic, he tried to use his high-level access to purge the 50-year-old records, to sever the digital threads connecting him to the crime. But it was too late. An automated alert pinged on his console. The files he was trying to delete had already been accessed, copied, and secured in a heavily shielded human embassy server an hour ago. The all-seeing architect, the master of time, had been outmaneuvered by a creature that could only see what was right in front of it. He was trapped, not by a vision of the future, but by the unchangeable, brutal facts of the past. The summons for a full formal hearing before the Concord Council was met with outrage, but Vance's media campaign had backed them into a corner. To refuse the humans' request now would look like a cover-up. The high chamber was filled, not just with the council, but with representatives from dozens of species, all whispering and speculating, their collective psychic field a tense, agitated hum. Vance and Aris stood in the center of the vast room, two small blind mammals in a coliseum of Seers. Their target, the current head of the Temporal Purity Foundation and the prime suspect, Master Lorik, floated in his designated position, his crystalline form radiating an aura of calm, condescending authority. He was the very picture of a being beyond reproach. "This hearing is a mockery," Lorik chimed, his voice resonating through the chamber. "The humans, having failed to solve the tragic death of Ambassador Vile, now seek to distract from their incompetence by exhuming a 50-year-old clerical matter." "This isn't about a clerical matter, Master Lorik," Vance said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the psychic storm. "This is about the disappearance and probable murder of Ambassador Katarik." He began to lay out the evidence, not with psychic force, but with a quiet, relentless stream of linear logic. He presented the financial records. He played the recording of the Kelth's final severed communication. He displayed the manifest of the personal items left behind. Each piece of evidence was a single, small stone, but together they began to build a wall, a structure of fact that the precogs could not see around. Lorik deflected every point with ease. "Correlation is not causation, Detective. These are coincidences, misinterpreted by a mind that cannot perceive the grander flow of time. The time streams were clear. Ambassador Katarik chose his own path." "He did," Vance agreed, pausing for effect. "But someone chose it for him." This was the moment. Aris brought up the final piece of evidence. The complete schematics for the null entropy device, recovered from Ambassador Vile's secret research files. "Ambassador Vale wasn't just a champion of inclusivity," Aris explained to the stunned council. "He was a historian. He was investigating the disappearance of Katarik. He had found the same inconsistencies we did. He had come to believe that a non-precog weapon had been used to hide the crime. Master Lorik, the truth is you didn't kill Ambassador Vale to stop his legislation. You killed him because he had discovered your original sin. He was about to expose you." Lorik's crystalline form flared with indignant light.
"Lies, slander from a primitive mind."
"You have no proof." "You're right," Vance said quietly. I don't, not for Vale's murder. But I think I have it for Qatar Ix. Vance locked his eyes on Lorik. This was the checkmate, the human gambit. Master Lorik, our forensic analysis of Ambassador Qatar Ix chambers, based on the original 50-year-old sensor logs, shows that his personal data slate was shattered by a focused kinetic strike. But we also found that a single shard, no bigger than my thumb, was overlooked by the initial cleaning crew. A shard that, according to the logs, fell behind a power conduit on the northern wall. Tell me, Master Lorik, as a being who was a junior aide at the time, do you recall that specific detail? It was a complete lie. There was no overlooked shard. There was no specific detail in the logs. It was a phantom, a piece of pure fiction. But it was a question about the past. Lorik, the architect, the master of the future, was completely unprepared. His mind, trained for eons to sift through infinite possibilities, instinctively tried to do just that. He looked for the future where he answered correctly. He looked for the future where he answered incorrectly. He tried to see the consequences of every possible reply. But the question was not about the future. It was a simple binary query about a fixed, unchangeable event. In his panic, trying to find a future that would save him, his mind betrayed him. There was no shard, he projected, his voice suddenly sharp with panic. The data slate was completely vaporized. I saw it myself. A collective silent gasp went through the chamber. He saw it himself. The past tense. The admission. The final damning beautiful confession. The seer had been so focused on the future that he had forgotten the one simple rule of a liar: keep your story straight. The confession, an accidental admission born from a logical trap a child could have spotted, shattered Master Lorik's composure. His crystalline form flickered violently as his mind, a consciousness built on the serene certainty of foresight, collapsed under the weight of an unchangeable, damning past. He had spent his life pruning the future, only to be undone by a single, immovable fact from yesterday. The truth once spoken unraveled everything. In his psychic death throes, a flood of memories and intentions poured out of him. A confession not just to the two murders, but to the entire 50-year conspiracy of the Temporal Purity Foundation. The council, the entire Concord, was stunned into a horrified silence. The impossible crime, the paradox that had threatened their civilization, had been solved not by a grand vision of the future, but by a grubby, meticulous examination of the past. In the cycles that followed, the Galactic Concord was thrown into a crisis of philosophy that shook it to its core. The Temporal Purity Foundation was dismantled, its members disgraced, its ideology forever tainted by its murderous origins. The very concept of precognitive infallibility was broken. They were a society of seers who had been blind, of architects of destiny who had failed to see the rot in their own foundation. They were forced to confront a terrifying new reality. The future was not the only place where truth resided. The past was not a dead, static thing, but a living, breathing entity that could reach out and hold the present to account. It was a lesson they had learned at a terrible price. Vance and Aris were no longer the pitiable, blind primitives. They were heroes. Beings from across the Concord sought them out, not with condescension, but with a new, profound respect. They were the ones who could see in the dark. Counselor John, slowly recovering from the psychic assault, made a formal proposal before the chastened council. It was a radical, revolutionary idea. The Concord would establish a new branch of its Enforcer Division. This branch would not concern itself with the future, but with the past. It would be dedicated to the primitive, chaotic, and now essential human arts of forensics, investigation, and deduction. It was to be called the Galactic Forensics Unit. And they wanted the two humans to build it, to lead it, to teach an entire civilization a new way to see. The final scene is not one of triumph, but of quiet purpose. In a spacious new office high in the station's spire, far from their old, cramped embassy quarters, Vance and Aris stood before a massive holographic evidence board. The board was not filled with shimmering timelines or probability cones, but with photographs, data logs, maps, and lines of text connected by threads of light. It was a map of the past. On it were a dozen new files, cold cases from across the Concord, disappearances and accidents that, in light of Lorik's crimes, were now being viewed with new, suspicious eyes. 50 years, Vance mused, looking at the file for Qatarik. 50 years he sat on that secret, and he would have kept sitting on it if he hadn't gotten sloppy. It wasn't sloppiness, Aris corrected him softly. pointing to a new file he had just pinned to the board, a 30-year-old industrial accident that had killed a vocal critic of the Foundation. It was arrogance. He believed the past couldn't touch him. Vance took a sip of his bitter black coffee, a fresh cup brewed from a newly installed machine. He looked at the board, at the tapestry of lies and forgotten crimes, a puzzle box waiting to be opened. He looked at his partner, the quiet scientist, and for the first time in a long, long while, Elias Vance felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. His retirement was officially over. There was work to be done,